Because the moment you can observe a pattern, you are no longer fully inside of it. And that small distance, that moment of seeing rather than simply reacting, is where something new becomes possible. And I realize this isn't unique to me. This is human design. This is the original human language, our emotions. Not a problem to solve, but a system to understand.
Welcome to What's Your Code, a space where we pause the reaction, read the pattern, and trace the belief shaping your reality. Because what keeps repeating isn't random. It's code.
Have you ever been in the middle of a moment, a conversation, a decision, a reaction, and something inside of you said quietly, "I've been here before." Now, it's not a place or not a person, but a feeling. The same tightness, the same pull, the same response almost before you chose it. Most of us have felt that. And most of us, when we feel it, might ask some version of the same question. Why do I keep doing this? In today's conversation, I want to offer something different. Not the answer to that question, but something that probably will change the question itself. Because I don't think the pattern is the problem. The pattern, I think, it's information. And information, once you can read it, can change everything. I want to tell you something about where my work came from, because it didn't start as a system. It started as a question I couldn't answer about myself. What I eventually built from that question is something I call now I Am Codex. And it's a framework for reading the patterns that run underneath your decisions, the ones most people feel but never fully see. But before I show you, I want you to understand where it came from, because it didn't start with research or theory. It started with something much more personal. I could feel the distance between who I was and who I sensed I could become. But I didn't have the language for what was in the way. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like not having a map, not knowing what to call what I was feeling, not understanding why it was so hard to move, even when I could clearly see where I wanted to go. And it wasn't only in my mind, it was in my body, in the way I held tension before I even recognized what I was reacting to, in the pace of my breath when something old got activated. So I just got more and more curious and started asking deeper questions. I went into the science of the brain, into how patterns form, into why certain responses feel almost impossible to interrupt. I went into the heart, into the research on how emotions function as signal, not just a feeling to manage or suppress. I needed to understand why humans feel what they feel, and why, even when we know something needs to change, moving through it can feel like pushing against something invisible. I needed to understand how these invisible forces had so much power over our own humanity. And somewhere in all of that, I started seeing the same structures everywhere, in the brain, in the body, in behaviors and systems. The same universal sequence, moving through everything. And I realized this isn't unique to me. This is human design. This is the original human language, our emotions. Not a problem to solve, but a system to understand. So before I go further, I want to ask you something. Think about a pattern in your own life, something that repeats, a way you tend to respond under pressure, a dynamic that keeps showing up in your relationships, a decision loop that feels familiar, even when you wish it didn't. Now, you probably already have something in mind. Now, here's the question I want you to hold. When did that start feeling automatic? Because that question is the beginning of something really important. Here's what I've come to understand about patterns, not as a concept, but as something you can actually feel. A pattern is not a character flaw. It's not evidence that something is wrong with you. It might feel that way. And that feeling is worth acknowledging. But what I've learned through my own experience and through years of watching how people move through change is that patterns are not accidents. They are responses that made sense at some point. They worked, or they felt safe, or they were simply the only option available. Maybe it was something you received before you had words for it. And then they repeat it. And then they repeat it again. Until one day, they didn't feel like a response anymore. They felt like you, not just in the mind, but in the body, in the way you hold your shoulders, in the pace of your own breath. When someone says something that activates something old, that moment when a pattern stops feeling like something you do and starts feeling like something you are, that's where most people get stuck. not because they're not capable of change, but because they're trying to change something they can't yet fully see. And this is not just a personal experience. The science has been confirming this for decades. Back in 1949, a neuroscientist named Donald Hebb mapped something that changed how we understand the brain. Neurons that fire together, wire together. What that means is that the brain physically builds highways around repetition. The more a response fires, the more efficient that pathway becomes. Not because it's the right response, but because it's the familiar one. The brain isn't doing this to limit you. It's doing this to conserve energy, to make the familiar faster. It's efficient. But here's what that means in practice. The responses that once helped you navigate something difficult becomes the default, even when the situation has changed, even when you have changed. And some of those responses, they didn't even start with you. They were absorbed from the people closest to you, or they were already running before your earliest memory. The code just kept running long after the original reason for it had passed. And when the World Health Organization officially classifies burnout as an occupational phenomenon, and when the American Psychological Association reports that more than 3/4 of adults experience stress that affects the body, their mood, and their behavior, I think part of what those numbers are measuring is the cost of running patterns that no longer fit, the exhaustion of it, the disconnection of it, the quiet friction of it. It's not a motivation problem, but a pattern problem. So let me show you the sequence, because once you can see it, you'll start recognizing it everywhere. And it starts with a signal. A signal is something you feel before you understand it. It is the emotion that arrives before the thought, a tightness in the chest, a pull towards something, a resistance you can't quite name, an activation in the body before the mind catches up. In the language of code, that's the input. Something entered your system. In human language, that's what it means to feel. Most of us don't pause to listen to the signal. We just respond. And that response is not random. It was learned, or it was inherited, or absorbed from the people closest to you before you even knew what was happening. At some point in a situation, a response formed around a signal, and it worked, where it felt safe, where it was simply what was available. So it ran again and again and again. And here's what repetition does. It makes things automatic, and that's not unique to behavior. That's how anything becomes efficient. The brain learns this input creates this response, and it stops asking every time. In code, that's the detection and the decoding. Your system recognized the signal and ran the response without waiting for permission. And here's the part most people miss. A decision was made. It always is. Every single that enters your system resolves into a response. And that's not optional. It's just how the system works. The question is, where were you when that happened? Because when you weren't, when the signal came, the response fired before you arrived, it might feel like a flaw. It's not a flaw. It's just how code works. And here's something that surprised me when I started really looking at this. Some of the sharpest, most self-aware people I know still run patterns that surprise them. Not because they can't see them, but because seeing alone doesn't complete the sequence. You can be fully aware of a pattern and still not be present enough to do something different when it fires. That's not failure of insight. That's the difference between recognizing a pattern and having the agency to meet it differently. But here's where it gets deeper. Because when a response repeats long enough, it stops feeling like something you do. It starts feeling like something you are. The pattern becomes identity. In code, that's the update. The response became the operating system. And that system doesn't just run in your thoughts. It runs in your posture, in your heartbeat, in the way your voice changes before you decide to speak. Maybe in someone who shuts down under pressure, someone that always needs a plan, and someone that just can't ask for help, or someone that starts things but never finishes. None of those are facts. They are patterns that have been repeated long enough to feel permanent. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else I could offer you today. Because what was learned or inherited or absorbed can be seen, not analyzed, not judged, not immediately to fix, just seen. held in view without collapsing into reaction. And that act of seeing, of observing the pattern clearly enough to hold it, is what gives it proportion. That's where it begins to lose its grip. And what can be seen can be understood, not just recognized, but known well enough that something different becomes possible. Because when you can see the pattern clearly and you understand how it formed, you're no longer just inside it. You're standing at its decision point, and this time you're there, you're present, you're aware. Not through force, not through willpower, not through deciding to be different, but through a kind of alignment where what you feel, what you observe, and what you understand begin to move together. And that alignment has a structure. In later episodes, we'll explore this a little more deeply. I call it the decision architecture. But what matters right now isn't the name. It's the felt sense that you've always been navigating this, even when you didn't have language for it. That's what this work is. Not fixing something that needs to be fixed, but reading something that's been running and beginning to choose what comes next. And once you start seeing these sequences, you'll begin to observe it in places you may have never looked before. In the meeting where someone asks for your feedback, and you feel that familiar pull to stay quiet, even though you have something real to say. In the career decision, you keep almost making and then find a reason to wait. In the relationship dynamic that keeps showing up differently, but somehow always feels the same. In the way you respond to a family member and realize somewhere in the middle of it that this response could even be older than yourself, that maybe you've just been carrying something that started before you had a say in it. And these are not failures of effort. They're patterns running automatically. An emotion arrives, the input. A familiar response follows, the code runs. A decision resolves, whether you were there or not. And somewhere along the way, the response started to feel just like the person you are. But here's what I want you to consider. What if it's not? What if it isn't? What if it's simply the most practiced response you have to an emotion you've never fully stopped to feel? So where does this leave us? Not with a fix, not with a list of steps, but with something that might matter more right now. A different kind of question. Because most of us spend a lot of energy trying to change what we do without ever seeing what's driving it. Awareness is not the whole answer, but it is the beginning of one. And awareness starts with something simple. Observing, not judging, not analyzing, not immediately jumping to fix it or skipping ahead to understand it all. Because there's a difference between observing a pattern from inside the feeling and observing it from a distance, where it stays as something to figure out instead of something to feel. Just observing from inside the experience, allowing yourself to be with it before you try to understand it. Because the moment you can observe a pattern, you are no longer fully inside of it. And that small distance, that moment of seeing rather than simply reacting, is where something new becomes possible. So the questions I want to leave you with today are simple. What patterns have you been living inside that you haven't yet fully named? When did that start feeling automatic? And what might become visible if you gave it your full attention for just a moment? So as you move through your day, observe not only what you're doing, but what's running underneath it. The emotion that arrives before the thought, the response that arrives before you've chosen, the story that starts playing almost before the situation is complete. Listen, your patterns are not your identity. They are your history showing up in the present. And some of that history predates your own memory. And history, once you can see it clearly, doesn't have to keep writing the future.
Thank you for pausing with me. Until our next reflection, notice, what's your code?